I want to make sure it doesn't roll back out. Let us pray. O Lord, open our ears to hear your word and know your voice. Speak to our hearts and strengthen our wills that we may serve you today and always. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. We're kind of nearing the end of Lent. If you'll remember, we started this journey by having a symbol of death put on our foreheads on Ash Wednesday. So it kind of seems appropriate that we, as we get closer to the end of the season, spend this last Sunday before Holy Week kind of seeing what God's doing and how God's messing around with graves. Now, the other reading for this morning was from John, and it's the story of Lazarus. But I was tired of 45-verse-long readings from John and decided that we should spend some time with Ezekiel because I think he, too, has something to tell us. And so, from a lectionary standpoint, today is all about death and resurrection in the readings. We simply are not going to look at Lazarus this morning. So God kind of plops us down along with Ezekiel in the middle of a valley of dry bones. Very dry bones. Very dead bones. Lots of dry, dead bones. I specifically used the picture on the front of your bulletin because sometimes when we see the images for the dry bones, we see a little scattering of bones here and there in a valley. And that's not what we have. We have piles of bones, hundreds of thousands of bones in this valley. And we're dropped into the middle of it along with Ezekiel. So this isn't some just simple little bones hanging around or a skeleton that's lightly broken up. These are piles of bones. The picture that you see, I think, comes from the time in Cambodia with the Pol Pot regime where a number of Cambodians were executed, and if you've seen pictures from that, bones were piled that high, and children were involved in helping that. So there's numbers. The reading for Ezekiel says that it exceeds that of a multitude of an army. So it's thousands. And it's difficult for us to exaggerate the seriousness of this story. And it's important because this is occurring at the time of the exile, and it's a national disaster, if you will, of a crisis in faith. In 597 BCE, the first Jewish exiles are taken to Babylon from their home. And over the next 10 years, they are taken into exile into Babylon. Those that aren't wanted stay behind. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, was so adamant about making sure that the Israelites would pay attention and do what he wanted, he would slaughter anybody who stood in his way. He destroyed the entire city of Jerusalem, including the temple where people, the Jews, worshiped their God. He absolutely leveled the town. So when the Jews were allowed to start coming back to Jerusalem, what they saw was the loss of the land that had been promised to them by God, had been given to them by Joshua. They saw the last of the Davidic kings in exile and in captivity, rather. Now, you can't find the Valley of Bones on a map. If Rosa were here, we would say, on your trip to Israel, did they show you where the Valley of Bones is? It is not a physical place that you can find. But it is a stark, reflective story, if you will, that represents a complete devastation, a humiliation, and hopelessness of a thoroughly defeated people. They have been stripped of their personalities, their identifying characteristics. We come to know them collectively as the house of Israel. And that's how God refers to them, the house of Israel. And it's important to understand that the dry bones represent the whole of Israel. Their complaint, if you remember, is our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off completely. This indicates that these are the bones not of those who were killed. This is not a resurrection of dead from being murdered or slain, but a resurrection of those who survived the exile. Because you see, what happens is they may have felt cut off from God because of what happened to them, but most assuredly they felt cut off from God because they had no temple in which to worship God. And so in their minds, perhaps the covenant had been broken, and any possibility they had of seeking God was taken from them. And when you cut them off from seeking God, they are as good as dead. So what we're talking here is about the dry bones representing the living exiles. And if we look at it in those terms, then we have a vision that is concerned not with the reality of death, but with despair. The exiles are the survivors, yet they have dug their own graves with their fear of God's absence. And they cry out. What do we do for people, for any community that loses hope in the midst of pain and suffering? What do we do for them? What are the words that help the community find God in the midst of grief and loss? We too ask that same question: can these bones live? Now, God tells Ezekiel that the problem with this community is pretty simple. They've lost their faith and their hope. They see themselves in this valley of bones. They see themselves as dead, as unholy, as set apart from God in a faraway place where they cannot reconnect. The hope that comes from the prophet. And the prophet is told to prophesy the words that the Lord God tells him to speak. And as you heard Connie just a few minutes ago, God is going to give the bones hope. And the hope for the people points them into a new way of thinking, a new way of doing that which they've always done. As God gives them life, it will be a life in a new way with new ways of doing things. Newness in this context is not a sign that everything will be well. This is not like a Lazarus. We bring him up, he lives, and all things are well. The people will be going to a new place. They will be experiencing significant change that is debilitating to their existence. They are not going back to the life as they knew it and the life that they once had. They are experiencing God in new ways, even as they experience life in new ways. So Ezekiel is led to this valley by God where his experiences are twofold. And he has two stunning newnesses, if you will. I'm not even sure if that's a word. Any grammarians here? No? Well, it's a word now. Two newnesses. First one. He finally sees a vision of God's sovereignty. Talk about that in a minute. And second, the newness of life created by God's sovereignty. Both God's sovereignty and newness of life are impossibilities as judged by the dry bones in the valley. To the people, what God says he's going to do is impossible. It is beyond their comprehension. And yet, faced with impossibilities, we have a need for imagination. Imagine the possibilities. God invites Ezekiel to ponder that. Can these bones be brought back? Ezekiel wants to back away from it. He's not taking sides. He knows when to take the neutral ground. Only you know, God. Talk to them. Let's see what the possibilities are. And he does. He talks. And if you can imagine life in these dry bones and see it happen, what are the other possibilities for that community? If you can take piles of bones and will them to come together, to bring sinew and flesh together, what other possibilities might you be able to imagine? And Ezekiel uses the language given to him by God, and with the words of the prophet, he says, there is a noise, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone onto its bone. I looked, and there were sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them. The bones came together. The sinew and the flesh came back. And the people laid there. Because they were reconstructed, but they were not alive. Now, the promise of a new life means accommodating a new way for God to be at work in our lives. We don't get to tell God how we will allow God to work in our lives. We accommodate God. God says, you will do this. And much like any good mother, he'll nag you until you do it. Because God doesn't like to let go. Talk to me sometime about that, and I'll share my experience with God being a nag. Because new life, you see, is the place where hope transforms what is into what could be and what can be. The gift of a new life is fully attached to the breath of the divine. It is God's life-giving force. And so Ezekiel's words can only get the people so far in terms of the restoration. He can bring the bones together. He can do the sinew and the flesh. No small undertaking, by the way. None of us can do that. He does so by the fact that God has told him to do this. But that's as far as he gets them. They're all laying on the ground. Nobody's moving. And God says that we have to have my spirit to fully recover these dry bones. It is the very breath of God that makes a difference in the life and death of a community. Without the breath of God, you are dead. And it is in this sense that the breathing becomes a metaphor for the presence of God in our lives. Despite what the exiles feared, which was they were so far removed from God that God could not touch them, they did not realize that God was as close as their breath. Because that's how close God is to them and to us. And Ezekiel says, I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and they stood on their feet, a vast multitude. New hope, new possibilities, new life, new ways of thinking, new ways of being in the world, new ways of living in community, new ways of embracing God, of understanding God's presence. All facilitated by the presence of the Spirit, the very breath of the Spirit of God. And in the midst of hopelessness, new life can be created in word and in spirit. Now, you know, many communities are in need of new hope and new life. There are many that are broken and in despair as life changes around them in drastic ways and they don't know how to address it. Some congregations are sort of like communities where hope has long departed, where the presence and the possibilities of God are nothing more than fleeting thoughts. Our bones are dried up. They express some sort of physical weakness. They don't think about God being present. Those are the words of people at the end of their rope. They have nowhere else to go. And yet, standing against that kind of hopelessness is the ability of a prophet to awaken belief in hope, established on the awareness of God's reality and God's power. What seems impossible in human terms is very possible to God. Can these dry bones live? I suggest you imagine the possibilities. Amen.